so most of the people are in the room. So the other thing that's really a big deal for us tonight is the launch of this book. It's the first book that we have undertaken, that we have produced, and so that's a really exciting thing for us. But we are so proud of our director of exhibits, Maggie Brown, who puts together all of our exhibits here. We're so very proud of her. But that's not to slight in the least a good friend to the Tulsa Historical Society for many, many years, and that is Steve Clem. You all don't want to hear, you want to hear about this book, and so I'm going to be quiet. Enjoy yourselves, and books will be, how are we going to manage the signing afterwards?
Steve and I will be right over at that table.
That's what I thought.
Afterwards.
Yeah, so we'll line up, and if you can avoid telling the long tales about your experiences in the movie theaters, although we want to know that, but it's just there will be a lot of people behind you giving you looks. So with that, Maggie and Steve, congratulations. We're so happy that we're here to share this with you, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'd like to thank Michelle Place and the entire Tulsa Historical Society and Museum, my co-authors, as you know, and especially Maggie Brown. And Maggie, in addition to the accolades she just got, she's also responsible for the wonderful KAKC radio exhibit a decade ago. Did anyone here see that? It was very, very well done, and I had the pleasure of working with Maggie on that exhibit. And then also there was a book for that. And so it's just a real pleasure to get to work with Maggie again on another project.
I have some thank yous as well. I do want to check and make sure you can all hear us well enough in the back. Reese.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I put Reese on the spot, told him I was going to check with him. So I, of course, want to start also by thanking the staff here at the museum. I was lucky enough to have my name on the cover, but the rest of them were not, and they all put work into this project as well. So I would like all the staff members that are actually here in the room, I know they're not all here, to stand up and be recognized. I also would like to take a moment to thank all of our wonderful volunteers here at the museum, and I know a number of them here this evening. So if you are a volunteer here at the museum, please stand up. And our museum board members, I know there's at least one board member here who's very busy operating the camera, but if you are on the board here at the museum, please stand up. And I will not make this group stand up, but I do want to also thank all of the people that shared their memories with us while we were researching this project, either by completing our memory survey or emailing or calling and sharing their memories. We have some special people to introduce. And first on the list is Nancy Schaller. And some of you maybe, you can go ahead. Some of you may know, Nancy is the Tulsa Movie Theater expert, and as a volunteer here more than a decade ago, she put together a wonderful program on the history of Tulsa Movie Theaters that is very popular, and also helped us so much in our research. It was kind of our starting point, and so she's very important in Tulsa Movie Theater history. And next to her is Mary Jo Sartain, who I will also make stand up. And you will hear more about this in just a moment, but basically Mary Jo is responsible for making all of Steve's book dreams come true.
That's true. I have a couple of special guests that I want to acknowledge right now. First, I want to tell you about a very special woman, Laura Winston Birdsong. She was 21 when she started working at the Ritz ticket box office in 1943. She was there for 6 years. During and after World War II, Laura experienced the glamour of the ritziest theater in town, and she also got to see free movies, so that's like the perfect job. I wanted you to know that Laura is still going strong at age 98.
Come on.
But she was unable to attend tonight, so I'm going to introduce her daughter, Laura Ward. Would you please stand up? The next gentleman actually is in from Chicago, and we're honored to have him. This is a gentleman who worked at the Orpheum the last 5 years of its existence, from 1965 to 1970, while he was attending TU. And we're going to hear a story about this gentleman and something that happened to him at the Orpheum in just a couple of minutes. But right now, I just want Dennis Scott to stand, and you're welcome to that. Another person that Dennis has with him is a name that some of you may be familiar with. His name is Phil Judkins, and he's well known in theater organ circles here in Tulsa, and I've heard his name a lot. Is Phil here? Can he stand up for a second?
Okay, and now on to the book. You might wonder who was responsible for this crazy idea. And that would be Steve. He comes up with a lot of good ideas. And he's going to tell you a little bit more about how this project came to be.
Retiring from Public Radio Tulsa last summer, I was searching for projects so I could remain in denial about being retired. As a lover of movies, and especially old movie theaters, I realized there'd never really been a book dedicated to that particular subject. So since Arcadia Books is mostly images and captions, I quickly discovered it was Tulsa Historical Society that had all the wonderful images of these historic theaters. They even, as you just heard, had a historic movie theaters presentation, which is no doubt better than this one. And so I approached Michelle Place about the collaboration, and she said yes.
One of the very first stories that Steve told me as we began working on the book was about a time he ran into Gaylord Sartain in an airport, and they had a great conversation about Tulsa's movie theaters. Steve has remembered that for years, and it was truly his dream to have Gaylord write and share his story for the book. Okay, Steve, tell your story.
I'll be brief. This may be the only book, though, where the foreword was conceived 26 years before the book. Here's how that happened. A chance encounter with Tulsa actor and artist Gaylord Sartain in the Albuquerque airport in 1994. Sartain was returning from the movie set of Getting Even with Dad. Our flight was delayed, and we sat and chatted for a half hour about all things Tulsa, including all the wonderful movie theaters that had been lost. Sartain told me a story about discovering a historic photo of the Will Rogers Theater from the 1950s and spotting his bicycle in the bike rack in front of the theater. He also said that he had actually watched the movie that was on the marquee at the time at home, holding that photo in his hand. Anyway, Gaylord's story stuck with me, and so when Maggie and I started this project, I told her about that story, and she said, well, you know, his wife, Mary Jo, is a volunteer here at the museum. That was our in, and Tulsa treasure Gaylord Sartain agreed to contribute the foreword to our little book. Do you think it's a problem that the best writing in the whole book is on page 6?
Hey, what about my writing?
Oh, sorry.
Just kidding, the foreword is amazing. Early on in researching these historic theaters, we discovered that a lot of information on Tulsa theaters, especially online, is inconsistent. So we tried to find multiple sources to confirm our dates and information, and to find the correct answer to questions like, what was Tulsa's first movie theater?
The answer is the Dreamland in 1906, near First and Main, in a former cigar parlor. This Dreamland was only run briefly, and it's not related to the Williams Dreamland Theater in Greenwood that would appear a few years later.
The early theaters are challenging to sort out because many of them were very short-lived. They also had a tendency to move around a lot or change names. Here are a couple of examples, like the Strand at 117 South Main. It was previously called the Empire and the Yale. Even more confusing, Directly across the street at 118 South Main was a theater called the Wonderland Palace and State.
Not all at the same time.
That's true, Steve. Other theaters, especially the really early ones, had very little documentation left to remind us that they existed. So how do we know they existed? Primarily from newspaper ads and city directories. From those sources, we learned of some of those first theaters with very interesting names, like the UC, which is U-S-E-E.
These small storefront theaters showed brief silent films and also had stages for live vaudeville shows. Called Nickelodeons for their 5-cent admission, they were clustered around 1st and Main in early Tulsa. One of them, the Lyric, opened in 1908, and it became one of the city's longest running theaters, operating for 30 years when the 1942 photos in the book were taken. The Cozy, it was on North Main on the viaduct, and it was another early movie house, and it operated for over 45 years, up until 1960.
Besides using traditional research resources, one of the ways we often gather information here at the museum when working on big projects is by asking the community for help. This book was no different. We asked people to share their memories and favorite stories of local theaters, as well as photographs and memorabilia they might have. As you can imagine, that led to lots of great information and stories, and we have a few of those to share with you this evening.
I mentioned earlier that Laura Winston Birdsong worked in the Rick's ticket booth. It was in front of the theater on 4th Street between Boulder and Maine. In an oral history at age 98, Laura recalled how the afternoon sun glared off the building across the street and into her eyes in the ticket booth. She also told me about one memorable evening at work. A phone call at the beginning of her shift. It was the Orpheum ticket girl, just up 4th Street, warning Laura about a gentleman who had come to the Orpheum box office, not buying a ticket, but asking for change over and over, eventually cheating her out of a $5 bill. Sure enough, a few minutes later, a man approached Laura's Ritz ticket booth, shoved a $20 bill into the slot, and asked for change. However, Laura surprised him by keeping his 20. Just think what a $20 bill is worth in the 1940s. The man was furious and threatened to summon the police. So Laura said, "Go ahead, there's a policeman on the corner of 4th and Main. I bet he'd love to hear about what you did down at the Orpheum." So the man left and did not return. But when Laura relayed that story to her boss, later that evening she got quite the lecture. "Do not do anything like that ever again," he said. "What if he'd had a gun? Your life is worth more than $20.
Okay, how about another great movie theater story? This one is about the premiere of the film Tulsa and Susan Hayward. The film premiere for the movie Tulsa was scheduled for April 13th, 1949, and everyone involved took the opportunity to plan one of the biggest parties Tulsa had ever seen. In addition to screening the film, there would be an entire day of activities for the community, including a parade and afternoon square dance downtown. There were also a number of private parties where the city's elite could mingle with the stars. Governor Roy Turner declared April 13th Tulsa Day. In preparation, there were Tulsa Day sales to encourage people to attend events dressed in Western attire. When the actual day arrived, businesses closed and schools were out. Seemingly everyone in Tulsa crowded downtown for the biggest event of the day, a parade. With financial backing from the oil industry, the parade and festivities grew bigger and bigger in size. Oil rigs were set up along the parade route and in front of each theater that would screen the film later that night. Oil companies decided the parade would be the perfect opportunity to show off their equipment and technology, and ultimately the parade included more than $10 million in technology and oil equipment, representing 100 different companies. In addition, there were 22 marching bands from area high schools, and of course the stars of the film, Susan Hayward, Robert Preston, and Chill Wills, who was a crowd favorite. In the end, the parade was 5 miles long and lasted 2.5 to 3 hours. As it
I like this presentation.
no more jokes, Steve, no more jokes. The crowd was estimated to be more than 100,000 people in downtown, although some began to leave or at least lose their enthusiasm after the first hour. As the parade passed the First National Bank building at 4th and Main, Susan Hayward exited her car and was lifted 75 feet in the air on an oil platform to speak to the crowd. Apparently, this was not something she knew was going to happen and was terrified the entire time.
The Star Theater in Sand Springs is where I fell in love with the movie experience. Many Saturdays I spent there as a kid in the 1960s. Now, you'd think that I would remember all the wonderful films that I saw there. However, my predominant memory is of the trauma of the concession stand. Instead of a line, it was a free-for-all. Kids crowded around the front of the counter, vying for the attention of the concession lady. I had to fight my way through the older, taller kids in order to order popcorn and a drink. I remember distinctly the look the concession lady would give me when I ordered the concoction as kids called a suicide. A little of each flavor of soft drink. Her dead-eye glance was her way of letting me know that I was causing her extra work. One generation earlier, during the 1940s, teenager Bob Jones in Sand Springs worked at the Star as a projectionist. He also distributed the monthly flyers that advertised the movies that were playing. He had an interesting way of getting them into people's hands, and his daughter, Terry Buzak, relates this story. The Star's owner had a twin-engine Cessna airplane, and he took my daddy and another guy up in the plane to throw pamphlets out advertising the Star and Harmony theaters. They found out later that was against the law because they littered the countryside. Terry later said that her dad, while still a teenager, moved to Kansas City and worked for Warner Brothers Film. Kansas City was the big hub for distributing movies in those days. All the studios had warehouses there where they shipped out the big reels of film to theaters across the country. Oh, and for the record, Terry's dad, Bob, is still active today at age 94.
Okay, here we have an image of the Ritz Theater, and this is an image with a very interesting story hidden in the details. During a 1960 newspaper interview, Ralph Talbot, who many of you may remember owned the big 4 theaters downtown, described his favorite memories. The most exciting was when Gone with the Wind was released in 1939. He described the scene. We had 2 shows a day with reserved seats only, and the line would stretch from the Ritz box office down 3rd Street to Boulder, down Boulder to 4th, and along 4th to the Western Union office. It seems that not much changed when the film was re-released in the mid-1950s. Crowds still lined up around the block at the Ritz, as visible in this image, but one of the noteworthy details in this photograph is that the 4th National Bank thermometer in the foreground reads 112 degrees. Was the crowd there for the film or the air conditioning? This image also provides a good view of the entire Ritz building at 4th and Boulder.
One of the interesting things I discovered while writing the book was that Tulsa's most ornate downtown movie palaces, the Orpheum and the Ritz, built in 1924 and 1926 respectively, were designed by the same person, John Eberson, one of the top theater architects in the nation. Eberson had previously designed Tulsa's Grand Opera House and Empress Theaters. The Ritz was what he called atmospheric. It was a style Eberson perfected in Houston and then brought to Tulsa. Built to resemble an Italian villa, atmospheric refers to the lights that were embedded into the ceiling to simulate stars, and the clouds projected overhead using a special machine called a Brenograph. The effect was like watching a film outdoors under a brilliant nighttime sky. Art Deco, especially streamline, was a popular style for Tulsa movie theaters built from the 20s to the 40s. The Delman, Will Rogers, Brook, Plaza, Tulsa, and Pines theaters were once among the city's deco treasures. Of those, only the Brooks sign and marquee remain.
One of my favorite things when doing research is hearing people's personal stories. So here are some of the favorite facts and memories people shared with us as we researched. The All right. The Cove Theater in West Tulsa, located at 2321 West 41st. Do we have any West Siders here? You can be excited. But yes, at least one. Oh, there's more. Okay, I just missed some. Okay, yay for the West Siders. The Cove had a crying room. This allowed patrons to remove their children from the main theater when they were being noisy, but still watch the show. Now, everyone's had that experience of drinking too much soda with too much time left before the film finishes, right? Apparently, the Star in Sand Springs had a solution to that problem. High windows in the restroom, so you didn't have to miss any of the action. And a story about the Will Rogers. Who remembers the Will Rogers Tower? A lot of you, I'm sure, with the light on the top. Apparently, that light bulb had to be changed by the staff at the theater. So one person remembers her brother having to climb all the way to the very top to change that bulb.
Since you mentioned the Will Rogers, another thing I learned is that beautiful architecture under the right circumstances or the wrong circumstances can be lost forever. That is the sadness of Tulsa's movie theater history. During urban renewal in the 1960s and 70s, many of the city's wondrous movie houses met the wrecking ball, including Tulsa's big four downtown theaters, Majestic, Rialto, Orpheum, and Ritz. A too common fate for Tulsa theaters was becoming a parking lot. Those included the Will Rogers, South Road Cinema, the Plaza, which is now the parking lot of Palace Cafe on Cherry Street, and the Tower Theater. The Delman was also demolished, and of course there's a Walgreens there now.
How scary theaters becoming parking lots. Those aren't my kind of scary stories. But who likes scary movies?
No. Sorry.
A lot of no's.
A lot of no's, yeah.
People shared some great scary movie stories with us, mostly from when they were children. So here are a few. And this is about the film The Tingler in 1959. I saw it at the Brook Theater with my sister and brother. During a chaotic scene, they projected a tingler-looking creature crawling up the aisle of the theater. It was terrifying. And from the Cameo at 1315 West 17th. In the early 50s, my sister and a friend of hers went to the Cameo to see a Frankenstein movie. The theater had a man made up to look like Frankenstein to be at the theater that day. As they were leaving, they heard a commotion and turned to see that Frankenstein was right behind them. They ran all the way home. And this story is from a woman whose parents managed the four downtown theaters, and they were there all the time, and so she and her brother were also there all the time and watched every movie that ever was released. And she describes how her parents used the movies as a babysitter. She says, the funniest time was when they sat us down to watch the film House of Wax. My brother was 4 and I was 7. It was so scary, I ran to the lobby crying to tell my dad my brother was hiding under the seat. He ran down there to get him. That is the last time I remember my brother being allowed to watch films with me. Now that was the first part of the story. Then she sent a follow-up email to reassure me. I want to tell you they had not seen House of Wax, so they didn't know how scary it was when they thought my brother would go to sleep. Just to clarify why they sat us down in the movie. They never forgot it, obviously neither did I.
Midnight movies became a thing in Tulsa in the 1980s, inspired by the cult film The Rocky Horror Picture Show. For that one, attendees dressed as characters in the film and threw objects such as toast and toilet paper at the screen at designated times in the movie. How would you like to be that employee who cleaned that auditorium at 2 a.m.? Theaters that had midnight movies included the Fox, the Village, and South Road Small Cinemas.
What else was great about going to the movies? You're going to think I'm going to say ushers, which is true, but that's not it. How about dates? Here are some funny stories about movie theater romance. My father was an usher at several of the movie theaters downtown. My mother was so enamored with him, he was very handsome. She frequently went to the movies just to be escorted to her seat by him. Her girlfriends would giggle and laugh as she would swoon. And from the Continental. I remember I took a date to the Continental Theater on a weeknight in the summer. We were the only two people in the theater, and I fibbed and told her that I had rented out the theater for us. Right on cue, the projectionist leaned out of the window and said, "Tell me when you want to start." It was really fun. Bet there were lots of dates at the Admiral Twin. Right? Oh, so I can tell a lot of people. I went on many dates at the Admiral Twin. I remember one. He had gotten a new used car and was so excited. I ended up spilling a Coke in my seat. And he was so upset, we left before the movie even started.
On the drive-ins, us baby boomers went there with our parents, played on the playground, rode the miniature train, and then crashed in the back seat during the movie. Then, when we got a little bit older, we tested our skills of fitting into tight and close spaces in the comfort of a car's trunk, sneaking into the theater with our friends. What? You never did that? The Admiral Twin carries on the drive-in tradition to this day. Although I think most people just ride in the passenger compartment now because their trunk is too full of stuff.
Okay, who has had something embarrassing happen to you at a movie theater? I noticed there are no raised hands. You don't want to share your embarrassing story. Really, it was probably only embarrassing to you and no one else noticed. But these folks shared their oops moments that have stayed with them for decades. Who knows what a reverse layout theater is? Okay, a few people. That's when you enter the theater from the front on the sides of the screen instead of from the back. Sometimes the restrooms were also on the side of the screen. One person shared that as a teenager, she was at the movies with a friend. She had to go to the restroom, which was at the front instead of the back. She was absolutely sure everyone was staring at her as she walked toward the screen to the ladies' room. And she remembers that decades later, so who knows, it was traumatic. Okay, from the Brook. It was 1964, and my brother and I rode our bikes to the Brook Theater and watched a movie. Because we were so young, we left when the screen said intermission. We thought the movie was over. Fortunately, a nice employee of the theater explained that the movie was only halfway over and let us back in. And from the Bowman Twin. I remember seeing E.T. at the Bowman Twin with two of my best friends, and in the sad bits, chanting quietly to myself to not cry in front of my other 11-year-old friends. I failed.
TU student Dennis Scott, who's sitting on the second row, worked at the Orpheum during the last 5 years. It was open from 1965 to 1970. Every chance he got, Dennis played the historic theater's pipe organ. One day, shortly before the Grand Ole Theater closed for good, Dennis returned from lunch to find two men, a father and a son, carrying the organ console out the side door and hoisting it onto a truck. They purchased it, and Dennis was heartbroken. 33 years later, as president of the Chicago Theater Organ Society, Dennis saw an online post that a man in Texas wanted to find a good home for an organ that once was in a Tulsa theater. Turned out to be the Orpheum's theater, the Orpheum's organ. The man placing the ad had been the son who Dennis had seen all those years earlier helping his dad load the heavy instrument out of the theater. That organ now is refurbished and resides in Dennis Scott's basement.
Just the console. Right. But Phil Judkins has the pipes.
Oh, nice.
And we'd like to find a nice home in Tulsa.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
Very nice.
So far, the Orpheum organ, all of its parts have had a happy ending. We like that. Tulsa movie theaters sure have changed a lot over the years.
Each generation had their own movie theaters. In the 60s and 70s, spacious standalone palaces gave way to multiplexes with big sound and increasingly smaller auditoriums. In the new millennium, however, some of the glamour has returned with huge complexes with up to 20 theaters under one roof, stadium seating, and plush motorized recliners. And you don't even have to stand in line to buy a ticket.
So many of Tulsa's historic theaters are lost. Our remaining links to the past are the Circle Cinema and the Admiral Twin, and they continue to provide their unique movie experiences. This book celebrates all of them for the magical qualities they possessed. Hopefully the volume will add to your enjoyment and serve as a gateway to your own memories of Tulsa Movie Theaters. And now, we'd be happy to answer questions.